Hi, everybody. We're going to continue with reading The King of Mazy May, and we're on 125. The last thing we talked about was the setting, and there's lots of clues to this being wintertime. And so we're going to start down here with 32. 32, the leader said, lifting his face to the men. 32 isn't recorded, and this is 33. Come on, let's take a look at it. I saw somebody had been working on it when we came up this morning. So I bet you 32 is Walt's claim. So now he's going to have to fight these men, I bet. 3 of the men went with him, leaving 1 to remain in camp. Walt crept carefully after them till they came to Lauren Hall's shaft. One of the men went down and built a fire on the bottom to thaw out the frozen gravel, while the others built another fire on the dump and melted water in a couple of gold pans. This they poured into a piece of canvas stretched between 2 logs, used by Lauren Hall in which to wash his gold. In a short time, a couple of buckets of dirt were sent up by the man in the shaft, and Walt could see the others grouped anxiously about their leader as he proceeded to wash it. When this was finished, they stared at the broad streak of black sand and yellow gold grains on the bottom of the pan, and one of them called excitedly for the man who had remained in camp to come. Lauren Hall had struck it rich, and his claim was not yet recorded. It was plain that they were going to jump it. Walt lay in the snow, thinking rapidly. He was only a boy, but in the face of the threatened injustice to old lame Lauren Hall, he felt that he must do something. He waited and watched with his mind made up till he saw the men begin to square up new stakes. Then he crawled away till out of hearing and broke into a run for the camp of the stampeders. Walt's father had taken their own dogs with them prospecting, and the boy knew how impossible it was for him to undertake the 70 miles to Dawson without the aid of dogs. Gaining the camp, he picked out, with an experienced eye, the easiest running sled and started to harness up the stampeders' dogs. There were 3 teams of 6 each, and from these he chose 10 of the best. Realizing how necessary it was to have a good head dog, he strove to discover a leader amongst them. But he had little time in which to do it, for he could hear the voices of the returning men. So he's going to steal their dog sleds and take it so he can get help. By the time the team was in shape and everything ready, the claim jumpers came into sight in an open place not more than 100 yards from the trail, which ran down the bed of the creek. They cried out to Walt, but instead of giving heed to them, he grabbed up one of their first sleeping robes, which lay loosely in the snow, and leapt upon the sled. Now, this page, I didn't do much active reading because this page kind of flowed a little bit better for me. I can see what's happening here. It's a little bit more of a movie to me. There weren't very many unknown words or any like events that were happening in the story. Page 127. Mush! Hi! Mush on! He cried to the animals, snapping the keen lash whip among them. The dogs sprang against the yoke straps, and the sled jerked under way so suddenly as to almost throw him off. Then it curved into the creek, poising perilously on the runner. He was almost breathless with suspense when it finally righted with a bound and sprang ahead again. The creek bank was high, and he could not see the men, although he could hear their cries and knew they were running to cut him off. He did not dare to think what would happen if they caught him. He just clung to the sled. His heart beat wildly and watched the snow rim of the bank above him. Suddenly, over this snow rim came the flying body of the Irishman, who had leaped straight for the sled in a desperate attempt to capture it. But he was an instant too late. Striking on the very rear of it, he was thrown from his feet, backward into the snow. Yet with the quickness of a cat, he had clutched the end of the sled with one hand, turned over, and was dragging behind on his breast, swearing at the boy and threatening all kinds of terrible things if he did not stop the dogs. But Walt cracked him sharply across the knuckles with the butt of the dog whip, so he let go. It was 8 miles from Walt's claim to the Yukon, 8 very crooked miles, for the creek wound back and forth like a snake, tying knots in itself, as George Lucan said, and because it was so crooked, the dogs could not get up their best speed, while the sled ground heavily on its side against the curves, now to the right, now to the left. Travelers who had come up and down the Mazy May on foot, with packs on their backs, had declined to go round all bends, and instead had made shortcuts across the narrow necks of creek bottom. Two of his pursuers had gone back to harness the remaining dogs, but the others took advantage of these shortcuts, running on foot, and before he knew it, they had almost overtaken him. Holy smokes. So over here, given your prior knowledge, what conclusion can you draw about the way Walt feels? Well, I'm sure he feels angry because dishonesty makes people angry. Maybe excited because he's being chased by grown men. Maybe a little bit scared. Page 128. Halt, they cried after him. Stop or we'll shoot. But Walt only yelled the harder at the dogs and dashed around the bend with a couple of revolver bullets singing after him. Now, this phrase, remember we pay attention to words and phrases from the author. I know what this is called from poetry. Bullets don't sing. That's that's human characteristics, and that's called personification. But what that does is it really helps the reader visualize what's going on. I can really hear them whizzing past his head through this phrase. At the next bend, they had drawn up closer still, and the bullet struck uncomfortably near him. But at this point, the Mazy May straightened out and ran for half a mile as the crow flies. Here the dogs stretched out in their long wolf swing, and the stampeders quickly winded, slowed down, and waited for their own sled to come up. Looking over his shoulder, Walt reasoned that they had not given up the chase for good, and that they would soon be after him again. So he wrapped the fur robe about him to shut out the stinging air, and lay flat on the empty sled, encouraging the dogs as he well knew how. At last, twisting abruptly between two river islands, he came upon the mighty Yukon sweeping grandly to the north. So what does the word abruptly mean? Twisting abruptly. I think this means suddenly or quickly. He could not see from bank to bank, and in the quick falling twilight it loomed a great white sea of frozen stillness. There was not a sound, save the breathing of the dogs and the churn of the steel-shod sled. Now snow had fallen for several weeks, and the traffic had packed the main river trail till it was hard and glassy as glare ice. Over this the sled flew along, and the dogs kept the trail fairly well, although Walt quickly discovered that he had made a mistake in choosing the leader. As they were driven in single file without reins, he had to guide them by his voice, and it was evident the head dog had never learned the meaning of gee and haw. Down below, there's footnotes. Gee and haw are commands used to tell an animal to turn to the right or left. He hugged the inside of the curves too closely, often forcing his comrades behind him into the soft snow, while several times he thus capsized the sled. There was no wind, but the speed at which he traveled created a bitter blast, and with the thermometer down to 40 below. This bit through fur and flesh to the very bones. Aware that if he remained constantly upon the sled, he would freeze to death, and knowing the practice of Arctic travelers, Walt shortened up one of the lashing thongs, and, whenever he felt chilled, seized hold of it, jumped off and ran behind till warmth was restored. Then he would climb on and rest till the process had to be repeated. Looking back, he could see the sled of his pursuers, drawn by 8 dogs, rising and falling over the ice hummocks like a boat in a seaway. The Irishman and the black-bearded leader were with it, taking turns in running and riding. Night fell, and in the blackness of the first hour or so, Walt toiled desperately with his dogs. On account of the poor lead dog, they were continually floundering off the beaten track into the soft snow, and the sled was as often riding on its side or top as it was in a proper way. This work had tried his strength sorely. Had he not been in such haste, he would have avoided much of it, but he feared the stampeders would creep up in the darkness and overtake him. However, he could hear them yelling to their dogs and knew from the sounds they were coming up very slowly. When the moon rose, he was off 60 Mile, and Dawson was only 50 miles away. He was almost exhausted and breathed a sigh of relief as he climbed on the sled again. Looking back, he saw his enemies had crawled up within 400 yards. At this space they remained, a black speck of motion on the white river breast. Strive as they would, they could not shorten this distance, and strive as he would, he could not increase it. Walt had now discovered the proper lead dog, and he knew he could easily run away from them if he could only change the bad leader for the good one. This was impossible, for a moment's delay at the speed they were running would bring the men behind upon him. When he was off the mouth of Rosebud Creek, just as he was topping a rise, the report of a gun and the ping of a bullet on the ice beside him told him that they were, this time, shooting at him with a rifle. And from then on, as he cleared the summit is the highest part, of each ice jam, he stretched flat on the leaping sled till the rifle shot from the rear warned him that he was safe till the next ice jam was reached. Now it is very hard to lie on a moving sled, jumping and plunging and yawning like a boat before the wind, and to shoot through the deceiving moonlight at an object 400 yards away on another moving sled, performing equally wild antics. So it is not to be wondered at that the black-bearded leader did not hit him. After several hours of this, during which perhaps a score of bullets had struck about him, their ammunition began to give out and their fires slackened. Took greater care and shot at him at the most favorable opportunities. Yet was also leaving them behind, the distance slowly increasing to 600 yards. Lifting clear on the crest of a great jam off Indian River, Walt Masters met with his first accident. A bullet sang past his ears and struck the bad lead dog. Oh, hope he doesn't die. The poor brute plunged in a heap, with the rest of the team on top of him. Like a flash, Walt was by the leader, cutting the traces. With his hunting knife, he dragged the dying animal to one side and straightened out the team. He glanced back. The other sled was coming up like an express train. With half the dogs still over their traces, he cried, "Mush on!" and leaped onto the sled just as the pursuers dashed abreast of him. The Irishman was preparing to spring for him. They were so sure that they had him that they did not shoot, when Walt turned fiercely upon them with his whip. He struck at their faces, and men must save their faces with their hands, so there was no shooting just then. Before they could recover from the hot rain of blows, Walt reached out from his sled, catching their wheel dog by the forelegs in mid-spring and throwing him heavily. This snarled the team, capsizing the sled and tangling his enemies up beautifully. Away Walt flew, the runners of his sled fairly screaming as they bounded over the frozen surface. And what had seemed an accident proved to be a blessing in disguise. The proper lead dog was now to the fore, and he stretched low and whined with joy as he jerked his comrades along. By the time he reached Ainsley's Creek, 17 miles from Dawson, Walt had left his pursuers a tiny speck far behind. At Monte Cristo Island he could no longer see them, and at Swede Creek, just as daylight was silvering the pines, he ran plump into the camp of old Loren Hall. Almost as quick as it takes to tell it, Loren had his sleeping furs rolled up and had joined Walt on the sled. They permitted the dogs to travel more slowly, as there was no sign of the chase in the rear. And just as they pulled up at the Gold Commissioner's office in Dawson, Walt, who had kept his eyes open to the last, fell asleep. And because of what Walt Masters did on this night, the men of the Yukon have become proud of him and speak of him now as the King of Mazy May. So, why did they people call Walt the King of Mazy May? Well, because he protected the claims and he beat the bad guys. So, after you guys get done reading this, marking it up, answering the questions, make sure the vocabulary words, which are listed, get put into your digital notebook. And then I believe there is a test on this story on quizzes. Please make sure you get that turned in before the link closes because I can't refresh it. All right, so have a great day. Make sure you do all the exit tickets. Make sure you're reading Don't forget about your book clock number 2 of biography. That's due the 25th. Take care. We'll see ya.